While I love my Arcade1Up Tempest game, I wasn't wild about the Marquee. Straight out of the box, it looked washed out, even in daylight. And when placed side by side with newer cabinets such as Street Fighter II, it just didn't hold up. I've added new Marquees to my Space Invaders and Asteroid games, which were easy projects, so when I saw Retro530's Tempest Marquee, I knew it was time to make an upgrade. The kit from Retro530 includes everything you need to replace your existing Marquee, including new LEDs, light box, screws, power connections, drilling template, and instruction sheet. The housing is 3D printed plastic and is available in several colors. While not the look of the original 1980s game, I chose the red border for its sinister glow. And after I tested the Marquee using the game's 12-volt power supply, I knew I'd made the right choice. To begin, I moved the game out of my arcade and removed the game's back panel. While working on this project, I also completed several others by adding a matching riser booster to the machine and volcano player start buttons. And in a previous video, I installed a 3D printed coin door with LED buttons. All those projects can be found on my YouTube channel. The kit comes with a splitter and adapter to power the new Marquee, but because I had already added so many other LEDs to this game, I swapped it out for a 4-way splitter purchased from LED Supply. I used the larger splitter to connect all of the LEDs to the game's 12-volt Marquee power socket, keeping the connection simple and neat. To remove the old Marquee, I first removed the screws from one side of the screen's white mounting brackets. Next, I removed the screws from the old Marquee, as well as loosened the screws from both sides of the upper support bar at the back of the game. Doing this will allow you to spread the cabinet side panels apart at the top by 1/4 of an inch. I then removed the top panel, as well as the 2 screws from the L bracket that connects the Marquee to the speaker panel. I wiggled the Marquee to release the alignment pegs from one side and then slipped it out of the cabinet. I also removed the pegs from the front of the speaker panel at this time. When I tried installing the new Marquee, I found it wouldn't fit. Had I read the instructions thoroughly, I would have discovered that I also needed to remove the white L bracket attached to the speaker panel. Once the bracket was out of the way, the new Marquee dropped easily into place. After replacing the top panel, I used a bar clamp to hold the cabinet together and install the screws. Note, you will need to replace the old Marquee screws with the shorter ones supplied in the Retro530 kit. I plugged the Marquee into the power supply and then fired up the game to test it. With its glowing red border, the new Marquee looked fantastic, and at this point, if all you wish to do is replace your existing Marquee with a new one, then you're finished with this project. However, the original Tempest Marquee was angled to match the front slope of the cabinet, so I decided to see if I could replace that look as well. With a simple test, I was able to determine that the slot at the back of the new Marquee's housing had enough play in it to accommodate mounting the unit on an angle while still fitting into the top panel. However, the top panel isn't long enough to be able to bring the new Marquee flush with the front of the side panels. I could, however, still keep the top panel and angle the Marquee. I just needed to leave it recessed in the cabinet. Deciding this is what I wanted to do, the next step was to fill the gap between the Marquee and the speaker panel. So I needed to cut a filler that measured 17 13/16 of an inch long. This board would need angled edges to fit properly between the Marquee and the speaker panel. To measure the angles, I first slipped a piece of paper between the angled Marquee and the speaker panel to make a pattern. The filler would need to be 1 7/8 of an inch wide. By making folds in the paper, I used it as a guide for setting my table saw's blade to the correct angles. The first cut was a 12.5-degree bevel, and I cut the board larger than I needed so I had room to make the second angle cut. The second cut required an 18-degree bevel. Be sure that both cuts angle inward at the top of the board for it to fit properly in the cabinet. Back to the workshop, I decided to attach the filler to the speaker panel using the old Marquee's alignment pegs. After marking the location of the peg holes, I clamped the board on my workbench with another board on top of it to keep the drill from splitting the soft MDF. Be sure to drill the peg holes at a 90-degree angle to the beveled edge for the filler to fit properly. I test fit the pegs as I worked, then I returned the filler to the cabinet to check that the holes lined up. As you can see, even with the pegs, the filler was a bit loose and still needed screws. I used the kit's Marquee template to set the correct level for the filler, then drilled and countersunk holes for 1 screw on each side of the cabinet. I used number 8 by 1 inch wood screws and carefully tightened them by hand to make sure I didn't strip out the holes in the soft MDF. After testing the Marquee in this position, I set to work on drilling its mounting holes. Using the template again, I marked the holes position on both sides of the cabinet. I then clamped a backer board to the outer sides to keep the drill bit from damaging the finish when it penetrated the surface. Before drilling, I applied a 2-inch strip of masking tape to the panel under the hole's location to catch the sawdust. This helps keep the dust off the screen, which is still mounted in the cabinet. After drilling, fold the tape over to capture the dust inside and then discard it. The kit includes pan head machine screws to hold the Marquee in place, and the screw head sits up on the surface of the cabinet. I tried to countersink one, but ended up damaging the exterior finish, so for now I left the other as is. With the Marquee in place, I tested the game again. From normal viewing angles, you'd never see the MDF filler. However, I knew I couldn't leave it that way, so I pulled out the board and gave it 2 coats of Rust-Oleum semi-gloss black acrylic paint. I let it dry for an hour, then reinstalled the board in the machine. The black paint gives the modification a factory finish appearance. As a bonus, Retro530 included some of its 3D printed screw hole covers in the Marquee kit. Just snap these into place. I used 2 of the larger ones to plug the empty original Marquee holes, and I used one to hide most of the damage I'd caused in attempting to countersink the left side's Marquee screw. With the modifications complete, I moved the game back into my arcade and settled in for some quality Tempest time. I am thrilled with how the modifications on this cabinet turned out. And even though my new Tempest Marquee doesn't have the exact look of the original, its sharp colors and clean printing really make the game stand out. Thanks to Retro530 for making a solid kit. For more modification videos on Tempest and some of my other Arcade1Up cabinets, check out my YouTube channel, Pop Art Studios. And if you like what you see, consider subscribing.